let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
This is so awesome.
We are an open culture that believes in
What is that process that a developer, or let's say,
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed?
Hi, and welcome to another episode of In the Cloud. I am your host, Stu Miniman, and we are here in spring. It is April of 2024. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm super excited for today's episode. In my old world, this would be the middle of conference season. I would be traveling all over the place, going to lots of shows. At Red Hat, we are deep in planning for Red Hat Summit, which is just 3 weeks away in Denver, Colorado. Super excited for that. And actually, next week, we have a special episode with our Chief Product Officer, Ashesh Badani. So be sure to tune in for that. But last month, I was at KubeCon CloudNativeCon in Paris, and a friend of mine who usually I get to catch up at the show, Nigel Poulton, will be joining us here on this episode. So Nigel's super busy. He is a speaker at a lot of shows. I saw him presenting and talking a lot of booths, probably signing a lot of books. He is the author of the Kubernetes book, which has been translated into tons of languages. He was a Docker captain, so containers, Kubernetes. He's been digging into WASM a lot recently, so looking forward to digging into all those. Nigel, thank you so much for joining us. Apologize for anybody that was hanging out at the top of the hour. We were working through some technical details, but here we are.
100% my fault as well, Stu. I'm really sorry about that for anybody that was there at the top of the hour, but we're going to make it good. We're going to have some fun.
Yeah, Nigel, it's a DNS issue, right? It always was.
Call it
right?
that. It's always the network.
It's always the network, except when it is. Well, Nigel, actually, quick hot take. Cisco just finally closed the acquisition of Isovalent. Goodbye for $650 million. Hot topic in the cloud native space. We're big fans of VPBF here at Red Hat, and using it in our products. Do you like that move?
I do, mate. Yeah. So I feel like, anytime I put my ear to the ground, I'm at conferences and speaking to people and stuff, it feels like there's two hot topics in the cloud native ecosystem at the moment. I think it's fair to say that AI is hot everywhere. Okay, so I'll park that for now. But the other two things for me are WebAssembly or WASM and eBPF, and Isovalent obviously leading the charge with that. So I'll be keen to see what they do there. But I think the potential is massively good. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is going to be a little departure. Yes, we will touch on AI, but that's not the main thing we're going to talk about here, Nigel. As I said at the top, you've got a heavy background. You've written a lot of books. You've probably trained more people on containers and Kubernetes than like anyone out there, just because from all the Pluralsight courses, the books, things like that. How's that feel, Nigel? I mean, at the show, you must get stopped constantly. I mean, I know how many people I know at KubeCon just from going over the years and, from my media days and the like. But I mean, like you and Kelsey Hightower feel like the ones that everybody probably know.
Do you know what, mate? It's massively humbling, actually. So it was a dream of mine a lot of years ago to one day write a book. I think when I was starting out my technology career, books were hugely important in me gaining that foundational understanding. So when I first started in technology, I was working with something which maybe some people may not have heard of, but Novell NetWare. And the company I was at was making a migration to Windows NT, and I bought this book called Mastering Windows NT 4 by a guy called Mark Minassi. And I was super privileged to meet him later on in my life. But do you know what? Like when you're young and early in your technology career, I know it's a little bit different now, but when you and I were back in the day learning, Stu, I think books were huge for a lot of people. And I remember spending what felt like hours in my local major bookstore perusing the IT section, like which of these 5 or 6 books on Windows NT 4 do I want? Because they were like, I don't know, like $40 or something like that if I was to convert it. And that's a lot of money for me at the time. And I bought Mark's book. and it was massive for my career, honestly. And I thought to myself at the time, I would love to be able to give back, if you will, at some point later on in my own career, like do for somebody else what Mark's book did for me. And then I go to these kind of events and I'm signing books, and privileged to have like a lot of people line up, and a bunch of the people that get this, that, you know, the signed books know me from videos and other stuff. It's cool, don't get me wrong, I like it, but it is also super humbling. But I'm waffling a bit, but I'm super chuffed that I've been able to, or super pleased that I've been able to kind of realize one of those early career dreams, if you will.
Yeah, it's Nigel. You say, you know, some things have changed, but we had a huge line at the Red Hat booth at KubeCon when we did the book signing. So, you know, absolutely, it's a great way to learn. It's tough to keep up. I mean, you know, Kubernetes book, you know, it was funny. I was looking at your Amazon store, and it was like, okay, wait, you know, which books have the latest chapter in there for the latest version? So, yeah, you as an author must be, is it a little challenging to kind of keep up on the, you know, at least now it's only once every 4 months, but
Yeah, I know.
it's that the cadence of change in the space, you know, is massive.
Yeah, so I maintain 4 books at the moment, 2 on Docker and 2 on Kubernetes. And in each of those spaces, I've got one that's like short and for super beginners, and another one that is longer and more boring, that you would never read cover to cover, right? More of a reference. And between October and January every year, I go through like a major refresh of all 4, and it's really hard work for me. I kind of start out, so I approach the beginning of October, and I haven't touched a book for a while before that. And I'm like, oh, I'm really excited to start doing these updates. And come January, when it's time to publish them, I am like, I could easily live without seeing Docker and Kubernetes forever. But you know what? Like, I think a little bit like you, Stu, that I just love technology. There's something inside of me that loves it. Like, I used to watch Star Trek when I was a kid and dream of living in a world where you could speak to computers and stuff. And we kind of live in that world, if you will. So I also feel super privileged to be in the space. And, you know, even though I get to the end of doing the book refreshes and I think, honestly, never show me Kubernetes again, within 3 or 4 weeks, I'm like, right, let's get back at it. So
well, Nigel, luckily you've got the refresh of the community. You know, when you attended the show in Paris, I'm sure is energizing for you.
Yes, yeah.
Love to hear, you know, what was your experience, that cloud native ecosystem we talked about, you know, briefly. You know, AI, of course, was, you know, big buzz at the show. The whole first day keynotes were all about AI and NVIDIA and Mistral, and you know, some really good content, because at the end of the day, I think the CNCF's narrative, which, you know, of course, at Red Hat, we like this one, is AI is a phenomenal workload to run on containers and Kubernetes. And there's a great fit there, but would love, you know, what's your take? You, you know, talked to a lot of people, you were working with a number of companies in the partner pavilion. So what were your key takeaways?
So I think like probably a couple of positives, right? So you feed off the energy of the people that are there. And I know that a lot of the people, certainly that come to the book signings and the other booth events and things that I do, tend to be people that are new to the cloud native ecosystem and quite new to Kubernetes. You know, it's funny because I think the first edition of the Kubernetes book that I wrote, and I believe I'm right in saying this, the first edition of the Kubernetes book was the first ever book written on Kubernetes, I think in 24, I can't remember anyway, a while ago. Yet here we are years later, Kubernetes is 10 years old now. And we're getting thousands of people turning up to KubeCon that are brand new to Kubernetes. And I think like for some of us, okay, particularly people like you and I, Stu, that have been involved in it for a long time, we start to think that like, oh yeah, Kubernetes has been around for ages. But then to meet people regularly that they're like, well, actually, I've not really done anything with it, and we're about to start doing something with it, that kind of, I don't know, reignites that passion, if you will. So I feed off the people that are there. I feed off the booths as well, because I love going around kind of the startup booths as well. The people that are, I don't know, may not even be here in 1 or 2 years' time, but are trying exciting things. And I would say probably the third thing is I feel like the cloud native ecosystem, look, it has its challenges. Of course, any community and ecosystem does. But it's such a kind and approachable community, if you will. I I dipped my toes in with the early Linux community, right? And I was very much like a pre-packaged Linux person, you know, like Red Hat, I guess, that made it easy for somebody like me. But if you, in the early days at least, if you ever strayed away from like something that was already packaged for you and you had to ask the community for help, some people were really not very nice to you. And I have not had any experiences like that with the cloud native ecosystem in the community. So I buzz off everything at these kind of events like KubeCon and stuff like that. There's so much cool stuff going on. In fact, you know, if I just wind it back to when I was saying, when I was a young kid, like a teenager, and I used to watch Star Trek and dream about working with technology and talking to computers and stuff like that, tricorders, and yeah, it doesn't really matter. But the thing is, like, those things that I dreamt of back then, I know we're not flying around the universe in spaceships yet, but I feel like the technologies that we've got in our daily lives are better than the ones I dreamt of when I was a teenager. Like, the things that we innovate on now and the things that we can do now are so much cooler than what my dreams were when I was a kid.
Yeah, I mean, Nigel, we do have Kubernetes running on the ISS, and we've already got Linux on Mars, and you know,
Yeah.
Kubernetes definitely is going to go there. So while you and I, unfortunately, aren't you know, flying around there, you know, some of those things are pretty cool. We've definitely got plenty of space geeks, you know,
Yeah.
in our group. And you're right, this community is awesome. Nigel, if you're looking for the ones to push back in the cloud native ecosystem, just post on Reddit, tell them what you're doing. You'll get lots of people to tell you that you're doing everything wrong. And which project you should be doing. But no, to your point, the community at that event and around a lot of those projects are very welcoming, and a lot of it, it's, you know, Nigel, it's open source, so we need more contributors. The project pavilion was really buzzing at the show, and to your other point, you said a lot of the people are new starting out. We just got the metrics back from the CNCF. It was a little over 12,000 people that attended, and more than half of those were brand new for the first time. So
That's
that
unbelievable, isn't
that
it?
trend, right? Is it the ecosystem keeps growing? It's there. So Nigel, I'm curious. We talk about communities, we talk about contribution. This last year has been a little bit bumpy for open source in general. You've got everything like, you know, HashiCorp and some of the database companies changing their licenses. AI is making us all look again at where does open source play in that overall development. I'm curious, does this tie into your world? Do you have some thoughts on kind of open source and, you know, kind of the dynamics in the industry?
So I think if I would want to zoom out of that massively, okay? And if we
Yeah.
look big picture, so if I just try and make analogies to my own career, right? So I remember when I first saw VMware, and I apologize if anybody's heard me tell this story before, but when I first saw VMware, I was a mixture of, well, look, I was mainly amazed, but I was also a little bit scared because it was changing things. Yeah. I was amazed at how cool it was. And I was like, wow, how come I didn't think of that? Right. And then when Docker came along, that was another major change. But it was a much bigger change, I think, than moving from just physical servers to VMs. We were refactoring applications and things. So I had that mixture of excitement, but also a little bit of trepidation, or a little bit of, is this going to impact my job? Is this going to impact the way I do things going forward? And fortunately, I feel like I made a good decision, and I decided to dive in the deep end and just try to see if I could swim, right? Same happened with Kubernetes, and I feel like a similar thing is happening with WebAssembly, though I'm unconvinced as whether or not I can swim when it comes to WebAssembly. But I think just taking that sort of a pattern where we're constantly going to have change, right? I think if any of us tries to set in a career or build a company or build a team or build a product or anything like that without thinking there is going to be change, you're just asking for trouble. So I look at AI and I look at all of these things, and it's just the same that I had with containers and Kubernetes and VMs and things like that. It is going to change. I can't stop it changing, and neither can you, Stu. None of us can. We know that, right? So I say to people all the time, you know, you've got to embrace it. I was over in Costa Rica recently at a Kubernetes event, and while I was there, we went and visited some local schools and universities, and I was looking at the kids that were there, or, you know, the students, and I was saying because they were asking about AI all the time, and I was saying there are going to be, in 5 to 10 years time, maybe even sooner, there are going to be a lot of leaders in the AI space, and don't see any reason why it shouldn't be any one of these students in the room. Like, you've just got to take the opportunity, dive in and go for it. It's after AI, I'm sure it'll be something else, but you've got to have an appetite to say everything's always going to change, and I can either run away from it or I can try and ride it. And you know what, as well, Stu, I think, like, if we think about it as a wave, because when we talk about WebAssembly, we talk quite often about it being the third wave of cloud computing. And I always think about trying to bodyboard, or, well, I would say surf, but I can't surf, but bodyboard a wave, right? I'm going to fall off loads of times. And you'll do that in your career, and you'll do that with your teams and your startups. You'll fail all the time. But just have that sort of attitude to get back on and go again, because we all have to do that. Like, you'll get it as well. But like, people, you know, they think because I've written a book, everything's easy for me and I know everything about everything. And I'm like, no, I struggle and I stress about things all the time, just like everybody else. But let's go for it, you know?
Yeah, it is interesting, Nigel. When I think back, you talk about kind of the waves of cloud computing, or the changes as to how we package things. Again, my background similar. We crossed paths back in like the arcane world of storage networking. And virtualization was like, oh, okay. As an infrastructure person, I took a physical server, I carved it up. What does that mean to the resources? We had like a decade of storage and networking were broken, and how do we get all that to work? When we go to containerization, the atomic unit that we dealt with was much closer to the application.
Yeah.
So some of the same things that we did for virtualization were the same, but some were very different. And, I don't speak application language as much as an infrastructure person that's there. And I watched the serverless world for a couple of years. And it was kind of an application down, not an infrastructure up discussion. And it feels to me WASM's that same space. It's much more in the application space. There's, of course, dependencies. And, we heard at KubeCon talking about how, WASM can run great on containers and Kubernetes. But, talk a little bit more, if you could, kind of WASM. What have you been looking at? What's resonating? What are the things that you're still scratching your head at? And how does it fit in this overall kind of balance of, my platform engineering's, a hot topic lately, but my ops team, my developers, data scientists, who cares about that these days?
Yeah, so just for anybody that is maybe similar to us, Stu, that isn't coming from an application developer background, that maybe comes from operations and infrastructure, I quite often will have people that are really pleased when I tell them that, because they come from that similar background and face those same hurdles that we have. Like, oh my goodness, everything is moving closer to the application, and it scares them. And when I can say, look, I've, through a lot of hard work and a lot of mistakes and a lot of agony, don't get me wrong, have managed to cut a career that I'm comfortable with in this space, gives them a little bit of hope. So anybody that's listening and gets scared about this stuff, yes, be scared, but kind of a healthy scared, a scared that motivates you. Yeah. I think the things in the WASM space that are interesting to me. Okay. So, there's a technology called the component model, which I feel has the potential to make rather large changes to the way that we develop applications and consume dependencies and things like that. But I say potential because I think you touched on serverless as well. And I'm not here to knock serverless or anything like that. I think serverless is doing great things. But I feel like there was a time where at least some of us thought that serverless might be as big as containers and do away with containers. And at least for me, it hasn't. It's got its place, and it does a job, and it's great. I'm still, though, of the opinion that WebAssembly could do to containers what containers did to virtual machines. And let me caveat that right by saying virtual machines are very much still important in the cloud. But I feel like the go-to solution for anything net new for people now is the container. I wonder if, fast forward enough years, maybe 5, finger in the air, right? Whether WebAssembly might be the go-to solution for anything net new in the cloud and on the edge. But a lot of people disagree with me on that and think that it might just be a little bit more like serverless, where it picks up a few bits and pieces in and around containers. But watch, if you're getting into WebAssembly, watch the component model. Okay, that's the bit I think that has a huge potential to change the way we do things. And then the last thing, if you don't mind me saying this, Stu, is so I went to WASM in Barcelona. I think it was like 2 weeks before KubeCon, maybe the week before. And I'd gone the previous year for the first ever WASM again in Barcelona. And no, the first year, I felt a little bit like if I had worn the Kubernetes t-shirt, I'd have been evicted and blacklisted and never allowed to come back. This year, it's funny. A lot of the WebAssembly startups and there's maybe reasons for this, okay, but there's been a huge mindset change there. Like Kubernetes was almost a hot topic at WASM. So just within the space of 12 months, I went from feeling like, I didn't dare say the word Kubernetes to if I said Kubernetes at WASM, I'd be in with a cool crowd this year. And I'm not sure where I stand with that. And I'd be kind of keen on your opinion as well, if you have one, as to whether or not. So in the past, right, it felt to me like the people that were innovating around WebAssembly in the cloud were like, yes, you can run WebAssembly workloads on Kubernetes, but you're not going to get the maximum out of it if you do it that way. You should go for a more bespoke platform. And I think that's always the case with any new technology, right? But it was very much like, yeah, Kubernetes, you can do it, but I mean, don't. Whereas this year, it's like, oh yeah, Kubernetes is now great for it. And I get that the idea that you have to meet customers where they are, right? Most people are deploying Kubernetes or looking to deploy to Kubernetes. And if you're going to just try and say Kubernetes is not for WebAssembly and we're a WebAssembly startup or whatever, then you're cutting yourself off from a huge market, really. So I don't know whether it's, I'm figuring out or trying to figure out, have the changes that they've made fundamentally made Kubernetes really good for WebAssembly workloads, or are they saying that in order to reach a wider market? Am I making sense with that, Stu?
Yeah, no, Nigel, absolutely. And right, at a macro level, you often see a new technology comes out and it's almost a religious war. So when Docker first came out, it was Docker's going to kill, containers. I'm sorry, Docker's going to kill virtual machines. And it was funny. I remember I interviewed like Ben Gullub, who was the CEO at VMworld. And I interviewed Solomon Hykes the first time at Red Hat Summit. And of course you see later, it was funny, Scott, the current CEO of Docker, I saw an interview with him on my old friends of the Cube, and he was talking about test containers and how it works wonderful with his good friends at Red Hat OpenShift. And of course, Docker and Red Hat had a little bit of bumping as to how we monetize and how we go to market on some of these things. So over time, they kind of come together. I mean, Nigel, we saw the exact same thing in serverless. Serverless was, why would you ever do containers? This is the way to do everything. And then, who's the leader in serverless? It's Amazon. And they talk more about serverless containers almost than they talk about Lambda these days. And we're part of that with what we've done with Knative. So, one of the maxims in general is nothing ever dies in IT. So to your point, VMs are going to be around for a long time. Heck, mainframes and the like are still there. So everything's kind of additive and the lines kind of blur between these technologies. What are the key use cases? What are customers really doing? My question for you is like, when you talk about where everything's going to live, all these net new applications seem to have some kind of component of AI. I think we understand real well how AI and containers and Kubernetes fit together. Does WASM tie into that story, or will it need to tie into containers and Kubernetes to exploit that technology?
I think it'll do both. I think so. And I would always say, don't quote me on anything to do with AI, because next week it'll just, potentially sound ridiculous. But I think the ecosystem at the moment certainly is looking at both options. Running AI workloads in WebAssembly, if I just call it native WebAssembly versus WebAssembly and containers on Kubernetes. But they'll also do AI within WebAssembly on containers and Kubernetes. Oh gosh, the levels of nesting there, love that. But I think they just have to hedge their bets everywhere. I know that a bunch of the startups in the space actually have got loads of demos and things out there that you can do to spin up, LLMs and things inside of WebAssembly workloads and stuff. Unfortunately, just because, so I did finish 3 of my book updates at the end of last year, but I'd put my Docker deep dive book was kind of, I wasn't updating it because it felt like, at least for the longest time, Docker had sort of stabilized, if you will. And I didn't feel like I needed to add a lot more content to it. And then last year, Docker had kind of a rebirth almost, and they've got test containers, like you say, they've got Docker Scout, Docker Debug, updates to Compose and things like that. So I'm super running behind on getting the 2024 edition update out for my Docker Deep Dive book, which is hurting me because I'm not able to spend as much time as I would like in the WebAssembly space on the AI stuff.
Okay. All right. So Nigel, we've got a new thing we'd like to try on this episode. It's going to be called Questions from a Red Hat, and it's some rapid fire questions. So let's see how this goes.
Oh, mate, I wish I'd had them beforehand. No.
Well, that's the whole thing on the rapid fire
yeah.
ones. All right. So you've already stated a little bit, kind of your position on AI, but what we'd like to understand a little bit is, you personally in your home, where's AI fit in the overall discussion? What are you doing with AI?
So I'm doing a lot less than the rest of my family. So my kids use their Snapchat AI assistant all the time. I caught one of my daughters using it to help her with a homework for school, a project on the moon. And my wife is currently doing a master's degree in early years education, and she is looking at, in several of her modules, how we'll be able to use AI in early years education. So I feel like, even though I'm the technologist in my house, that my kids and my wife are putting me to shame in the AI space at the moment, but I'll fix that.
Well, Nigel, it's almost as if, your family helped set up these questions. So the second question actually is, when it comes to kind of teaching in school, what are things that, you think they should teach at school that you were never taught?
Can I pick a non-technology one?
Of course.
So I think children should be taught more about financial management, how to manage a budget as the very basics, but how to invest money as well, so that they can potentially use money to work for them rather than them just work for money. I feel like a lot of children come out of school literate in science and math and English and things like that, but not financially literate.
Yeah, and Nigel, so I'll tell you, so here in the States, my daughter went to kind of the traditional high school and off to university, and she got nothing in the way of the financial training. My son, on the other hand, went to the tech high school where he got, hands-on training. He works on cars. They had required budgeting, taxes, all those sorts of things, because the expectation is that they're not going to university, even though I think most of us know, sure, you might take an econ class or a statistics class, but you don't learn the kind of real world skills. Even, God, I got my master's even, and, they didn't cover any of that stuff. I learned it by reading books and talking to people. So absolutely
mistakes probably
out there and the like, but I do expect it's going to be really interesting. We'll have to have you back in a year to talk about, your wife's findings on AI and where that all things, because for a lot of us, it's always like, how do we learn about the new stuff? It's awesome to have, teenagers or younger people to talk to. And for me, Nigel, I don't know about you, but, when I'd get together with family, it's not like we're talking about cloud computing, but when I do get together with family, we can talk about AI.
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting? One of the things that my wife has found as she's been doing this master's degree is that, and this is to be expected, right? But the innovation in AI is going where the money is, and the money is certainly not in public education, even in private education either, for things like this. So they are very much already behind the curve with regards to AI. Because there's just not, if you're a startup and you're building something AI, you're probably not going to go to schools and things because they're all strapped for budget anyway.
All right. So the next one's an easy question for you. It's a layup there, Nigel. So what's your favorite sci-fi TV show?
So I'm gonna go easy ball here. So I'll I love Star Trek, and I really do
Yes.
very much enjoy Star Trek
So
Discovery.
which one?
Star Trek Discovery. No, sorry, Strange New Worlds. Strange New Worlds. With Pike in it.
Excellent. So
I love
yeah,
that.
I was curious because I mean, I think most people know by seeing my thing, I'm more of a Star Wars
You are.
fan than I am Star Trek fan. But Strange New Worlds, I think, is awesome. I mean, I loved Enterprise when that one came out,
Yep.
so I like the ones that aren't necessarily, you know, the hardcore Star Trek fans love, but it's really good. Can I? One of your books, it has like a Star Trek.
Oh yeah. So
Yeah.
I do 3 sort of collector's editions for the
Yeah.
Kubernetes book, where they have like a Star Trek themed front cover and intro page. The rest of the book is in English or whatever language, right? But I've got one that is that has a Borg front cover, and it all kind of came from that because Kubernetes has links to Borg internally at Google, and the links with 7 of 9 and what have you. It doesn't really matter. Just because Kubernetes had these Star Trek themes in its foundings, I did 3 editions. So one has a Borg front cover, one has a Klingon language front cover, and one has what I call a Starfleet front cover. But if you know your Star Trek, it looks like the LCARS computer system from Star Trek The Next Generation. It's just geeky fun stuff.
That's all. I remember when how excited you were when the Klingon one came out.
Yeah,
because that was pretty amazing. Okay, yeah. Final one in the rapid fire. There any new apps that you've impressed you lately in the last few months? You know, I don't know about you, but for me, oftentimes it's like, oh God, I go like, you know, a year without adding a new app, and then somebody will tell me about something new. I'm like, oh my God, why didn't I know about that?
So my memory is terrible. Let me just have a look at my phone very quickly and see if
yeah,
there's any...
it's my wife and I have been playing with some of the language tutor ones there. So yeah, I've got one called Drops that I've been playing with because trying to learn a little bit of German. And she's been doing the classic Duolingo.
Yeah, so do you know what? My kids love Duolingo, especially my youngest. She learns Japanese with it and just is obsessed with Japanese culture. For me, I'm going to be, this is embarrassing, but I have almost a 400-day Snapchat streak with my middle daughter. And that is, I have snapped her and she snapped me every single day since I first got Snapchat, which is, let me just, I'll do this very quickly, Stu. I'll tell you officially. A 326-day, I probably shouldn't put that on actually, 326-day streak. So I've had Snapchat for less than a year. So we'll call that new. But my daughters do cringe at the kind of snaps I send. I think I'm cool and I think I'm tech savvy.
Yeah, Nigel. Yeah, I mean, you're keeping young out on the soccer pitch.
Yeah.
I tried a couple of times to figure out Snapchat, and I realized I think I'm just too old for it. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So look, thank you. You survived. You know, the quick rapid fire there. It's really interesting, as you said. Like some of these things are changing pretty often. You know, one of the things I always kind of look back at is like, if you've been doing something the same way for a few years, like find out if there's a newer way to do it. Like internally, like we have like slides that we present to customers and everything. It's like, if there's a slide that's 2 years old, it must change because the space we're in just changes way too fast. All the underlying pieces are there. So yeah, you know, want to thank, you know, authors like you that keep up on the technology and keep the source material going. So yeah, and Nigel, I want to give you a kind of final word. What's on your plate for 2024? What are you looking forward to?
So,
you know,
yeah, I'm going to find out whether I sink or swim in the WebAssembly world. I've been sort of dipping my toes in for a little over a year now, maybe 18 months. And I just need to bite the bullet and go for it. So if we do this in a year's time or whatever, I'll either be loving WebAssembly and killing it in that space, or I'll be like, don't mention WebAssembly to me. But you know what? On the topic of what you were saying there about change and stuff like that, this applies to me going into the WebAssembly space, but it applies to anybody that wants to do something a different way. Like you're saying, I say this all the time, right? We live in a golden age of technology, But as part of that golden age, it's also a golden age for learning new technologies and learning new ways of doing things. Like when I learned Windows NT with Mark Manasseh's book, I had to beg my old boss at work for a computer and one of those huge monitors that you needed a team of people to lift, set it up in the corner of my bedroom. And, you know, it was like 5 hours to build a Windows NT domain. And if I broke it, it was another 5 hours to build it. It was pain. But now, you know, with the cloud and with, you know, how powerful our computers and things are, you can learn anything so easily. Like it's there for everybody.
Yeah, the hope is that we all learn something. You know, the other side to that. I remember I wrote a blog post when Nick Carr came out with the Shallows and said we're trading kind of our base knowledge to Google. And the fear with something like AI is, well, I don't really need to know how to do anything because I can just, you know, ask Copilot or Gemini or one of these other things. So yeah, it's like, you know, I need to understand the basics of how coding works and how all these other things and how to troubleshoot, because otherwise I might get a bunch of code that comes back from one of these things and I won't know if it's right or not.
The thing is, though, you know, if all of us, if we wind ourselves back to like our computer science roots potentially, where, you know, we learned how to convert binary to hex and how all of the low level stuff worked or works. Now, I'd really have to dig deep to understand how some of this stuff fundamentally works. We just use high level tools all the time. And I would say that AI driven tools like Copilot and all of the others, it feels like to me are just another level up and a level up and a level up. And there's always been that tension of like, if you don't understand the really low level fundamentals, you're going to get stuff wrong. I get it, but I don't see that narrative changing at all, really. It's just another high level. Like if we were to dial it back, I don't know, 10, 15 years, we were still using tools that abstracted everything for us. And back to our storage days, you know, what platter and what sector on a disk drive, we could maybe figure it out if we had to, but we don't need to anymore. And I just think that, you know, Copilot and these AI tools, as long as we ground ourselves in it to start with, and you don't just start your career or whatever, or you're learning with the high level stuff, I think we'll be all right. But there is that danger that people just come and they start their career with the high level stuff without learning the stuff below, I think at least.
All right. Well, Nigel, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining. It was glad we got to catch up, you know, for this, even if we didn't get to spend much time, you know, at KubeCon itself. So thank you so much. All right. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. As a reminder, next week, we've got the preview of Red Hat Summit, which is coming up a couple weeks at the beginning of May in Denver. I will actually also be attending IBM Think, which is in my backyard here in Boston, a couple of weeks after Red Hat Summit. As always, if you've got topics you want us to cover, guests we think we should have on the program, please reach out to me. Super easy to get to. Just stu@redhat.com is my email address. And as always, thank you for joining us on your journey in the clouds.